You know, we're getting almost 1,700 people a day in the United States dying from cancer. And if you do that, if you divide that number by 24, it comes out to about 70 people per hour. Okay, this is not an insignificant, this is an epidemic. We keep throwing massive monies into these problems, billions and billions of dollars, both from the federal government and from private foundations. You know, the pink ribbon campaigns, you hear all about them. People just mindlessly run out and throw money at a problem. They have no clue where the money is going. There seems to be no accountability, either in the federal government or for the private foundations. It just seems to be a year in, year out ritual of throwing money at a problem with expecting something to be different, and generally it doesn't. What I do is I check the scientific advisory boards of the individual foundations that support, and then you can know why we're not making any progress. This is a lot of words, cancer statistics from 2024. What they want to say here is that we are making major progress in reducing the death from cancer. I spoke to someone the other day, this is the most exciting time for cancer and all this. And I said, what about all the dead people? Yeah, well, that's an unfortunate problem. You have to understand that having having a PhD in genetics and biochemistry, understanding mammalian genetics, I was led to believe always that cancer was a genetic disease. It was a silent assumption. The field, the NIH, National Institutes of Health, National Cancer Institute, all say cancer is a genetic disease. Of course, I had no reason to question that until I started doing my own research and clearly seeing that something was really not right with this, because we were collecting data on calorie restriction, fasting, and this kind of thing, showing that the lowering of glucose and the elevation of ketone bodies was strongly linked to the success of managing cancer. And that brought us to the work of the scientist Otto Warburg from Germany in the 20th century, leading scientist. And I began to see through our research here at Boston College that most of our work was supporting Otto Warburg's theory and not the somatic mutation theory, which is the general theory that most people think cancer is. And that's what it says on the National Cancer Institute website. It says cancer is a genetic disease. So as any scientist, you say, well, how can that organization be incorrect? But the more research that we did and the more observations that we made in preclinical models of brain cancer and metastatic cancer, the more and more we became convinced that cancer was a mitochondrial metabolic disease. So I started taking a much deeper look into the evidence supporting the somatic mutation theory. How is it possible that so many leading scientists and medical institutions throughout the world are of this constant belief with very little questioning of it? Sonnen Shinisato at Tufts University had questioned this, and I thought they did an excellent job. But I started to look more into it myself. And it became more and more clear that mitochondrial energy metabolism is at the core of the problem with cancer. We know what cancer is. It's cell division out of control, dysregulated cell growth. That's the textbook definition of what cancer is. It's not a complicated phenomenon. I mean, it's just cell division out of control. What causes that is damage to oxidative phosphorylation. So, and that leads to the dysregulation of the cells. So why does one cell start, or a group of cells start to divide out of control in some tissue or some group of cells? And the answer is the organelle that controls the cell cycle and the differentiated state of the cell is corrupted. It's not producing energy the way it should be. And why is cancer so pervasive? Because the environment that we live in today damages the energy metabolism in these cells, leading to what I just described as dysregulated cell growth. So how does that happen? Well, as I said, as I clearly said, there's many secondary causes of cancer. There's only one primary cause, and that's damage to the ability of the cell to generate energy through oxygen. What could damage that? Well, radiation could damage that. Chemical carcinogens can damage that. Intermittent hypoxia could do that. Chronic inflammation can do that. Oncogenic viruses, papilloma viruses, rare inherited mutations. These are all secondary risk factors, not the primary risk factor. Primary risk factor is damage to oxidative phosphorylation with a compensatory fermentation process. This is exactly what Warburg said. The issue, of course, is it can happen in many, many different ways. So we are today living in an environment that makes all of this possible. And then you couple that with a diet, highly processed carbohydrates, minimal exercise, in conjunction with these secondary risk factors, and you have an epidemic of over almost 1,700 people a day in the United States dying from cancer. It's not a mystery. To me, it's not a mystery at all. It's very clear, the basis for it. Warburg said if you lower the blood sugar, you're going to restrict the availability of the fuel to the tumor. And what I did to test Warburg's hypothesis, I went and looked at the structure and function of mitochondria in all the major cancer cells, and they're all damaged in some way or another. So, in biology, a foundational principle is structure determines function. We know this. Evolutionary biology says structure determines function. So when you look under the electron microscope and look at cancer mitochondria, they're all in various ways damaged. When you look at their biochemistry, they're damaged. They're not going to be able to generate energy through using oxygen. So how in the hell are these cells growing out of control if they're not behaving like our normal cells? And Warburg said they ferment. Wow, this is exciting. They ferment. That means they get energy without oxygen. This is an ancient pathway, again, linked to evolutionary biology. So you go back and you find that all the organisms on the planet before oxygen came into the atmosphere 2.5 billion years ago were all fermenters, and they were growing out of control, no regulation. So the tumor cells are doing nothing more than falling back on these ancient primitive pathways to grow. So the first thing you say was, what the hell are they? You can't grow without energy. Energy is everything. It's not that complicated. Energy is ATP. ATP is energy. Without ATP, nothing can survive, nothing can grow. So the question is, where are you getting your energy from? I'm doing fermentation. What does that mean? Energy without oxygen. Oh, well, what can generate energy without oxygen? Glucose is the prime fuel, the sugar, glucose. And now we have discovered, in no uncertain terms, that they can ferment amino acids. But the key amino acid is the glutamine amino acid. So we put the two together, completely restore what Warburg said. He just didn't know about the amino acid fermentation. And now we know. So I said, let's test. Why don't we test targeting these tumor cells by depriving them of glucose and the glutamine, the two fermentable fuels, and we kill them. Okay? And we're right at the beginning of this. We built the press pulse therapeutic process of how to kill cancer cells without toxicity. Now you say to yourself, well, why in the hell doesn't the field recognize what we're doing? Because they're locked into the ideological dogma that cancer is a genetic disease. So if you're locked into the dogma that cancer is a genetic disease, you're not even able to think about what I just said. And what's more, even if you do think about what I'm saying, you might lose your grant from the NIH because the NIH says cancer is a genetic disease. So you put it all together and you have this problem. The problem is we clearly understand how cancer arises. We clearly understand how to manage it. But the ideological dogma says, no, that's not right. Why? Because they either ignore or they don't understand what I just said. And I publish these papers. I try to write them in crayon so that even the dullest of people could understand it. And they still won't understand. But I'll tell you who understands it. The people in the street understand it. I'll tell you that much. So what is causing the dysregulated growth? Is it the mutations in the nucleus, or is it something in the cytoplasm, abnormalities in the number, structure, and function of mitochondria? So when the red nucleus from the red cell is placed in the green cytoplasm, this was done by Israel and Schaefer in vitro and in vivo both, they got regulated growth, which was scratching their head. And then they took the nucleus from the normal cell and put it in the cytoplasm of the tumor cell, and they got dysregulated growth. This is just the opposite, just the absolute opposite of what you would have expected if driver genes are controlling dysregulated cell growth. You wouldn't get these kinds of experiments. Newer experiments now, if you take the green mitochondria and purify them and put them into the red cytoplasm, you get regulated growth. And if you take abnormal mitochondria and put them into indolent cells, they become explosive. So clearly, what the nature is telling us is that this is a disorder driven by mitochondrial dysfunction, not by mutations in the nucleus.
And of course, there are lots of different types of cancer. You know, you can differentiate them depending on location in the body, brain, pancreas, prostate. Of course, the different pathological types of cancers as well. So when we say cancer, do we need to be a bit more specific about what we're talking about? Or would you state, based upon your research, that actually all of them are fundamentally the same? There is a problem with respiration. There's a problem with generating energy in the mitochondria. Like, just help us understand that, if you will.
Yeah, well, that's really so important, because we were all led to believe, and we still are pounded by information saying we have a therapy for your specific kind of cancer. You hear this all the time. Like, breast cancer is different from colon cancer, different from brain cancer, different from bladder cancer, different from the leukemias. You hear this all the time. And that's based, again, on the somatic mutation theory of cancer. When you start to look at the mutations in all these different cancers, they're all quite different from each other. They're even different from each other within the same type of cancer. Within the same tumor, you'll find all kinds of different mutations. But all of the cells, now what I did, I went back and I said, well, if all the cancers that we know are fermenting to get energy, that says there's some commonality between them. So in order to justify that, I had to go back and go through historical records on ultra histology, the way electron microscopy, ultrastructure of the cells in a cancer. So I would look at lung cancer, breast cancer, colon cancer, pancreatic cancer, bladder cancer, blood cancers, and I was looking for a commonality. And that commonality was abnormalities in the number, structure, and function of mitochondria in all of the major cancers. And that's what I found. And in the concepts of evolutionary biology, structure determines function. This is a well-established concept. Structure determines function. If the structure of the organelle that generates energy through oxygen is abnormal, the function of that organelle will be diminished in some significant way, leading to an alternative energy, which would be fermentation. So when I went back and looked at all of the major cancers, I found abnormalities in all of these different cancers. And then that would lead to the explanation that they would all need to have fermentation in one way or another. And that leads to the concept that if they do ferment, there's only two fuels that they can ferment, which is glucose and glutamine. And we know every major cancer is dependent on glucose and glutamine fermentation. So it comes right back to yes, they look different under the microscope. They look different in their genomic profiles, but metabolically, they're all very, very similar and will respond quite effectively to a singular strategy of metabolic therapy.
But it's so completely wrong. because there are, you look at the average, cancer, and they did this. I think Bert Vogelstein did a study, and he took cancers and said, how many mutations are there, right? And it wasn't one, it wasn't two, it wasn't three, it wasn't four. The average breast cancer, I think, had like 50. And, some of the brain cancers that you see in young people, there are like 200 mutations, right? So it's like, okay, that's ridiculous, right? 50 different genetic changes, and you still think this is a viable theory? Like, how are you going to do that? Give them 50 different agents to attack all these different mutations? You can't do it. On the other hand, you look at bioenergetics, and every single cancer cell, I mean, not every, but almost all, share the same difficulty described ages ago by Warburg, right? That, hey, there's a real difference here in the way they generate energy, fermentation versus respiration. And why is that? And everybody says, well, with the somatic mutation theory, it's just a quirky problem that happens. It's just a mistake. It's like, what? So every single cancer in history makes the same mistake, and you think it's just a coinky-dink, right? It's like, what are you talking about? Clearly, this is at the heart of the cancer, is the bioenergetics. Whether you're talking about mitochondrial health, which is important, and it does influence it. So things like autophagy and mitophagy and stuff influence it. So when you do talk about intermittent fasting and stuff, it does influence it. But insulin and glucose, you're still talking about the same thing, bioenergetics, right? How do cells get energy? They're all stuck in this. It's all about the genes.
Every one of those inherited mutations, like BRCA1 and P53 and all these others, they damage mitochondria. They disrupt oxidative phosphorylation. So someone who has a BRCA1, because not every woman who has BRCA1 develops a breast tumor.
Of course.
It's about 50 or 60% penetrant. If you have a mutation inherited that's 100% penetrant, then that's a primary cause of the problem. But since all the mutations are not 100% penetrant, they are risk factors, just as someone would be working in a factory with chemical carcinogens. Not everybody in the factory would get cancer from working with those chemical carcinogens.
Right. Does your lifestyle turn those genes on? Do they turn them off?
And the diet and lifestyle could provoke those chemical carcinogens or those genetic risk factors to become more prominent.
Absolutely.
So this is why you have to be aware of all of these things. I don't know if prophylactic removal of organs is the best way to deal with BRCA1, but I certainly think because it's not 100% penetrant, that means diet and lifestyle could certainly reduce the risk of having BRCA1 reduce the risk of having that.
Absolutely.
Type 2 diabetes, obesity, cardiovascular disease, cancer, dementia. These are all related to diet and lifestyle. Yeah, there's a few guys that might have a genetic predisposition to one of these things or another, but the majority of the folks, it's ourselves. And, people blame our genes. It's not, our genes are doing exactly what they evolved to do, store energy. We evolved as a species that was hungry all the time. We were always tracking down food to get to find out we needed to store energy. It's hard to store energy when you're eating only meats and certain vegetables that have very, very few highly processed carbs. So now you take that same metabolism and you throw it into a new environment where you have massive amounts of highly processed carbohydrates, minimal amounts of exercise and energy, and you get fat. All right? Because we evolved to store energy, and the genes that allowed us to survive on the planet as a species are now counterproductive to our health because we're in a totally new environment, killing us and causing an enormous amount of our financial resources to be thrown into managing chronic diseases, most of which are caused by diet and minimal exercise and consumption of highly processed foods, and it's convenient. Okay? How many people are sitting in traffic jams in every major city in this country? Rush hour, you're sitting in traffic jams. You're sucking down on a high carbohydrate coffee, a muffin. You're driving the car. You get into work. You sit in front of a computer. You run home. The kids are crying. You got to put something in the microwave real quick that's highly processed. You give it to the kids. You get childhood obesity. You get chronic diseases, and you start creating all these problems that were very new to our society. And now you're going to come out with billions of dollars trying to figure out how I'm going to stop obesity, how I'm going to stop type 2 diabetes, how I'm going to stop cancer. What am I doing about dementia? And we're not taking charge of what we know we should be doing. So we have institutions will come in and say, oh, take that pill, take this pill. We're going to treat you with this and treat you with that. But the real cause of it all, you got to go back to prevention. Okay. And it's hard. I'm not saying this is easy. I mean, the way we're running our society today, everybody's on the go all the time. Everybody's just locked into a computer with headsets, walking around with headsets on. I mean, we're just deviated so far, in a short period of time, a few hundred years into this new environment, and it's accelerating, massively accelerating. With the technology that we have, making our lives easier and easier, putting us at more and more risk for chronic diseases. And then you end up with cancer, and then you're trying to figure, oh, what's this cancer? The dementia, man, that's another epidemic. Obesity is an epidemic. Dementia is an epidemic. Cancer is an epidemic. And it's all coming from rapid changes in our diet and lifestyle over the last several decades. But if I were to have cancer, having written the protocol to treat cancer patients with my colleague Thomas Duryea, we're working on the treatment protocols right now. The first thing you're going to do is stop taking carbon, get your GKI down. People say, oh, I don't care how hard it is. That you get it closer to 2.0 or below 1, you're going to start killing cancer cells. So what we do, because it's such a hard thing, what we do is we take zero carb diets for about 10 days to see where your GKI is, and you can start to see it step down in the right direction. And then from there, you can step off into water-only fasting, because the trauma of doing water-only fasting, the difficulty of your physiology to do that, like as opposed to going cold turkey. Okay, you're going to eat a big meal today, and now for the next 5 days, you're not going to eat anything. The body goes through, it's almost like trying to break alcohol, nicotine addiction.
Yeah.
The brain is addicted to glucose. It's like an addictive agent. So you have to lower that addiction slowly with a zero carb diet. You're still eating, but you're not getting carbs. And then once you're down to a GKI of about 5 or 7, you jump now into water only fasting. Once you're in that zone of water only fasting, now, and you can keep a low GKI, that's when we come in with the battery of drugs, these repurposed drugs that hammer the glutamine and further lower the glucose. These tumor cells are toast. They can't handle this kind of a dramatic change in your body. They up and die. And not only that, the body cells compete directly with the tumor cells, starving them even further. And not only that, it's called autolytic cannibalism. Your body actually goes after the tumor cells and uses them for the fuel for the rest of the cells that are healthy. It's unbelievable. This is evolutionary biology in action.
It is absolutely amazing to hear this.
It's even more amazing to see it in action. When you say ketogenic diet, it's actually, you got to be very careful, because it's not necessarily a ketogenic diet. It's the state of being in therapeutic ketosis. And a ketogenic diet can put you in therapeutic ketosis, but many of these so-called ketogenic diets are not done correctly. People go out and eat too much of it. They don't do it the right way. It's nutritionally imbalanced.
Yeah.
I mean, but the bottom line, the underlying theme here is nutritional ketosis prevents chronic diseases. what kind of ketogenic diet? That's why we developed the glucose ketone index calculator. We published this. And what it does is it allows any patient, healthy or sick, to know whether they're going to be in a state of maximal metabolic homeostasis. And it's a meter. You can buy it on Amazon, the Keto Mojo meter. And you take a drop of blood, and you can measure with one stick your blood sugar and with another stick your blood ketones. And if you can get the ratio down to 2.0 or below, you are going to be in a state of metabolic homeostasis. And that really puts tremendous pressure on cancer cells, diabetes, all of these variety. In other words, you're bringing yourself back to a state of metabolic homeostasis with a quantitative measure to let you know when you're there. We can use diets to reduce glucose, but we can't use diets to reduce glutamine. And glutamine is an essential amino acid for the tumor cell. In fact, they call it a non-essential amino acid, but really it's quite essential for our immune system, for our gut health, for the urea cycle. I mean, we need glutamine. And glutamine is abundant. It's the most abundant amino acid in our body. So we have a situation here where our normal cells of the immune system need the same fuel, use the same fuel that the neoplastic tumor cell uses. So we have to, that's why we developed the press pulse strategy for managing cancer. You can press glucose down consistently because you're transitioned over to ketones. So we eliminate the glucose issue. But we use drugs to pulse glutamine. Because if we're too aggressive in targeting glutamine, we compromise our own immune system in its ability to pick up the dead cancer cells after you kill them, otherwise leading to infections and other kinds of adverse effects. So we use small doses of glutamine targeting drugs once the patient is in therapeutic ketosis. So we put them on just for a short time, dosage timing and scheduling, and then we pull them off. And let the immune system and the gut and everything come back to a normalcy. But you've already slaughtered a significant number of tumor cells. And then the immune system, our immune cells aren't killed by the deprivation of glutamine. They're just stunned. Mm-hmm. They're alive, but they're just like paralyzed. But once you pull the glutamine drug back off, our immune system reactivates and goes in and picks up the dead corpses. And we have to have a time period while this process is taking place. And of course, when you add the glutamine back or don't remove the drug, you will get the rescue of some of the tumor cells that might be there. But they're not coming back very fast because you got the chokehold on the glucose. So they're there, but they're growing extremely slowly. And then once our immune system comes back, recovers itself from the small dose of glutamine inhibitor, then we hit them again with another small dose of glutamine inhibitor, and we slowly degrade the tumor while the rest of the cells in the body are generating an excessive efficiency in health. So we're the rest of the cells in the body are getting super healthy while you're slowly degrading the tumor cells that are absolutely dependent on a fermentation metabolism. It's an elegant, beautiful system, and when it's done right, you can't believe how well it works. Problem is, Sanjay, nobody is doing that.
And when you found in mice is that when ketogenic diet was combined with hyperbaric oxygen therapy, the average survival time was increased by roughly 80%?
Yeah, even more sometimes now. But okay, so why do we do hyperbaric oxygen, right? That's the question. What's going on with hyperbaric oxygen? Why is this like a good thing? It works best when the patient and the mouse is in nutritional ketosis. Okay, so look, we have a tumor. We irradiate that tumor. How does the radiation kill the tumor cells? It hits oxygen, blows up, and it causes a reactive ROS, and it's like a stepping on a landmine. It blows the tumor up, right? So cancer cells protect themselves, even though they make a lot of ROS. They're this close to death anyway, but they have a very powerful antioxidant system. And interestingly enough, that besides causing the dysregulated growth, the glucose and the glutamine also protect them to some extent from the ROS that they're making. Can you believe this?
The ROS.
ROS, reactive oxygen species that are carcinogenic and mutagenic. So they destroy our proteins, lipids, and nucleic acids. They're disruptive molecules. So radiation will cause a ROS in the microenvironment, ROS, that'll blow up and kill cells, normal and tumor cells. But if you want to selectively kill tumor cells, with ROS, not to cause your hair to fall out, your gums to bleed, and all this crazy stuff, you take the patient, you put him in nutritional ketosis, and you say he's got low GKI. Then you go into hyperbaric oxygen, which dissolves oxygen directly into your blood now. It's better than just breathing 100% oxygen because you can actually dissolve oxygen in the bloodstream. Then you're taking away the two fuels that protect the tumor, and you're giving it internal ROS, which kills the tumor internally, only to the tumor cell, not to your surrounding tissues. So you're selectively killing tumor cells without collateral damage to the rest of your body. As a matter of fact, the rest of your cells are getting super healthy because they're burning ketones in pure oxygen. Unbelievable.
How do we measure if our...
Can you believe this? I can't even believe I'm saying this stuff myself. You really got to know the biochemistry, and you have to know the physiology of your own body, and you have to understand evolutionary biology. There's a lot of millions of cancer survivors that have survived standard of care, which is the radiation and chemo and whatever else that would be involved. But many of those folks pay a real price for that survival. They suffer immensely if they do survive, and many times they have ailments and debilities and problems that came about as the result of the toxic treatments they received. Many people are suffering from the surgical mutilations that their bodies have endured. Many people are suffering from adverse consequences of high-dose poisons that their bodies have been exposed to. Many people are suffering from the ramifications of high-dose radiation. So you have to look at the litany of ailments associated with cancer survivors, and that's an area of emerging medicine now, cancer survivor medicine. So if you feel that you have survived these massively toxic and mutilation treatments, you have many people, not all people, have a lot of psychological problems, neuropsychiatric problems. Many people have hormonal imbalance problems. Many people have problems with their microbiomes. Many people have problems with metabolic homeostasis. So you have a whole litany of problems that you never had, but for the fact that you survived the treatments that were given to you. And then there's those folks who don't survive these treatments. And some of these newer treatments will kill you faster than the disease itself, with the hope that you might be one of those, percentage of people that actually does respond really well to the treatment. And everybody wants to be that person who really does well. But in fact, many people are not that person. And they suffer immensely with chronic problems, sometimes for the remainder of their life. And a lot of times they don't live as long as as they could have lived had they not been subjected to these horrifically toxic treatments to manage a disease, which in my mind does not require the use of toxic treatments. So we have this problem. It's a massive tragedy in my mind. It's just something that doesn't need to have to happen.
What do you say to those people who they've just got a diagnosis, and their doctors are saying, right, listen, this is pretty bad, severe. We're going to suggest that you take chemotherapy.
Yeah.
You're not telling them not to take chemotherapy, are you?
I'm not telling them that. And what we found is that when you are in nutritional ketosis with a glucose ketone index of 2.0 or below, my colleagues that we work with in Istanbul, Turkey, were able to show that chemotherapies at much lower dosages can be even more therapeutically powerful when you're in nutritional ketosis. So you don't have to get rid of a lot of these different procedures that we have today. I'm just saying radiation for brain cancer. I'm not saying radiation for lung or some of the other cancers.
Okay.
Because if you can shrink those tumors down and make them very weak and vulnerable, a surgical procedure, a radiation procedure, even low dose chemo could come in, and even immunotherapy. If you took a big tumor and shrunk it down to a small nub, and it's resistant to a lot of the things, they all have to share something in common for them to survive this path. That might be an immunotherapy could come in because they're going to target whatever all of them have together, and you could possibly get rid of it that way. And as I said this over and over again, we published many papers showing that the radiation of the human brain frees up massive amounts of glucose and glutamine, which can explain why the demise of all these folks rarely make 5 years. It's very clear. But yet it's continuing to be done. And I, as much as I keep saying this and presenting the evidence over and over again, it doesn't have any impact. There's no movement, and there's no radiation oncologist that says maybe I shouldn't be doing this. It's just, it doesn't change. And the poor folks, they should know that. People with brain cancer should know as soon as your brain is irradiated, the probability of long-term survival is significantly reduced, even with keto. Now, I'm saying you could do much better with that. Pablo never had any radiation, chemo, or any of that stuff. And we're starting to see some other folks that are avoiding that. I'm not saying you shouldn't use sometimes temozolomide, which is the standard chemo, at lower doses can be effective under metabolic therapy. So we don't want to throw out everything. But certainly for the brain, radiation should never be done. I don't care what anybody says. You should never irradiate a person's brain who has brain tumor. It just makes it worse.
Yeah. My wife actually has radiation necrosis from that exact same thing because we didn't find you until after she had already had a round of radiation. Yeah.
Here's the problem. I can say all this stuff because I have done the basic research myself. I have looked into the concepts. I have studied these concepts. The problem and the great tragedy is when the cancer patient with a glioblastoma, lung cancer, breast cancer, whatever it is, they go to the top medical schools and they tell them, I want metabolic therapy. And they, we can't do that here because there's no evidence that it works. So these poor folks are now, hear what I say. They get all fired up. They go down to the top medical school to say, I want metabolic therapy. Well, we don't do that here. Well, who does? Oh, I'm going to lose my license if I do that. What the hell is going on with that stuff? So I feel bad when they say, whoa, where's Seyfried's clinic? I don't have a clinic. I'm not an MD. I don't treat patients. Why are there no clinics? Well, because a lot of the folks that would need to be doing this could lose their license if they treat patients without the standard of care. So why is the standard of care written in granite? Why can't it be modified in some way where the medical schools, they should be the ones? Dana-Farber, MD Anderson, Sloan Kettering, the Moffitt, the Fred Hutch, all of these major cancer centers throughout the country should be the ones that are doing this. Why are they not doing it? That's the question.
Cancer diagnosis using AI has the promise of just being a simple blood test. Then beyond that, once we gene sequence that cancer tumor, you can then vaccinate the person, design a vaccine for every individual person to vaccinate them against that cancer. And you can make that vaccine, that mRNA vaccine, You can make that robotically, again, using AI in about 48 hours. So imagine early cancer detection, the development of a cancer vaccine for your particular cancer aimed at you, and have that vaccine available in 48 hours. This is the promise of AI and the promise of the future.
Great, thanks.
And you're absolutely right. The cancer cannot occur if the mitochondria in the cell remain healthy. When you're basically a very healthy person, you're in metabolic homeostasis. So what's happening is our bodies are falling out of metabolic homeostasis as the result of a variety of insults from largely from the environment, diet, and lifestyle, and these kinds of things. But when you look back and say what is responsible for maintaining what in metabolic homeostasis, and it comes back to our mitochondria within the cells, the organelle that ultimately is responsible for the metabolic homeostasis within individual cells and within the body as a whole. So this organelle, when it becomes corrupted or dysfunctional, can manifest this problem in many different ways: cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, cancer, Alzheimer's disease, depending on the tissue and the cells of the individual. In cancer, we know for sure that every major cancer that I have studied has defects in the number, structure, and function of the mitochondria. Yeah. And this then causes the cells to fall back on a primitive form of energy, which is fermentation, and that leads to dysregulated cell growth. So I have a very clear idea of the origin of cancer and how to manage it.
Well, now we're back on the prevention side. So all of those things that you just mentioned are critical for preventing cancer from happening in the first place. I mean, we're only concerned about treating it after you have cancer. But if you don't have cancer, you don't have to ever worry about the kinds of treatments. Or if you can live a diet and lifestyle that would keep your mitochondria healthy so that you don't get a transition from oxphos to fermentation, then the probability of getting cancer will be significantly reduced. So, but this is the balance act you have to recognize. How do we know that? How do we know that if we have the right diet and lifestyle, that we will significantly reduce our risk for ever having to deal with cancer in the first place? And we know that from our historic evaluation of tribes, human tribes that live according to their ancient ways. And there have been a number of people who have investigated Aboriginal peoples. These are peoples who still live in non-Western side. They're in jungles, or they're in desert, or they're in the Arctic.
Modern day hunter-gatherer tribes.
Yeah, like Inuits from Canada and Alaska. You have, well, now today they're massively unhealthy.
A lot of sugar, a lot of alcohol today, but it wasn't that way before.
Yeah. So those folks were living. In fact, there was comments that Inuits, Eskimos never get cancer, and they eat fatty blubber, and they eat whales, and they eat seals, and they eat fish, and they eat this kind of stuff, and they don't eat many vegetables because where are you going to go when it's 40 below zero to get a piece of fruit. But in the summer, certainly they could gather some of these things up. But the great physician, humanitarian Albert Schweitzer recorded the African tribes had no cancer. He looked for 40,000 people were evaluated. He couldn't find any cancer. So what are these guys doing? They were pretty much following a lot of physical exercise, very low carbohydrate foods that they were eating, and they had a very different diets and lifestyles.
My thing was, I didn't want to die.
Like my liver's fully covered, so they've deemed me inoperable, incurable, palliative, terminally ill.
I knew I didn't want to go through chemo again.
It had already spread to my liver and my lungs. So now I was terminal.
With that news, it was kind of shocking. Without treatment, I think I have about a couple months to live.
The thing that we're trying to emphasize is that if you do metabolic therapy the correct way, you can not only manage the disorder, but you can also correct and fix many, many other problems that some cancer patients might have, like diabetes, high blood pressure, hypertension. So you actually get healthier as you're degrading your tumor.
It's down now to 0.05, which is almost nothing.
So here I am about 15 months, 18 months later, and I am doing really well.
I did that for 2020. In December 2020, I was cancer-free.
My wife had a stage 4 cancer diagnosis, and she used metabolic therapies. 1 year later, she was cancer-free.
And I'm not saying we throw out all chemo, because obviously you folks have done really well with chemo. What we're finding with fasting and part metabolic, part chemo, what we're finding is that dosages of chemo can be lowered significantly and still have powerful therapeutic efficacy. If you want to live and you want to get healthy, you do metabolic therapy. Now, that doesn't mean you don't do radiation and chemo. It would change the entire system, but they will not allow that to be done.